My name is Becky Steckler, and I am the Program Director for the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon. And I'm thrilled to be presenting some research I've been working on with some of my colleagues for roughly the last year. Think about the devil in the details, the shared mobility and greenhouse gas emissions. Before I get started, though, I do want to just give a quick plug. We have another webinar that's coming up in collaboration with the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. My colleagues Ann Brown and Amanda Howell will be presenting a webinar a little bit later in September, Mobility for the People, Equity Requirements across 239 shared micromobility programs. Be sure to just go ahead and search and check that out. And so, I'm going to tell you about some of the research that we've done, but I think it's really great to kind of put this into context. And I don't know about others, but one of the ways I've been doing a little escape during the pandemic is to read a lot of books. And so one of those was this fictional book that came out right before the pandemic about a coronavirus pandemic. And as I was reading this book, it was really great. And they got a lot of the details right. I was actually really impressed. But the one detail I kept on wondering about was, when were they going to get to the run on toilet paper? By April of 2020, you probably remember, about half of the stores in the United States had no toilet paper. And what it made me really think about was the fact that it's really hard to understand how these very large events are going to impact you personally. So, I watched An Inconvenient Truth. I've read some climate, global warming reports, but it didn't really hit me just how impactful, climate change would be until the year of 2020, when it felt like all of Oregon really caught on fire, and many of the places that I have visited and loved, burned almost to the ground. And of course, even though those fires were in other places around the state, it was really hard to breathe in Portland. And, so our family had our MacGyvered air filters that we were using in our house. And it became very clear some of the negative impacts that we were likely to experience. And of course, to put on top of that, roughly a year ago, the heat dome made an appearance in the Pacific Northwest. And we experienced, an ungodly 116-degree heat in the Portland metro area. And personally, this meant, bringing our pandemic chickens, the chickens we had gotten during the pandemic, into my basement so that they wouldn't bake outside. But of course, there's many animals and others that couldn't escape the heat. And, the loss of life was really kind of mind-boggling. And of course, that's just animals, not to say anything about the people who died because of that particular heat wave. And of course, this was just really off the charts. And it really impressed upon me, the likelihood of seeing other events that, again, are really off the charts, that are going to have very significant impacts on the people that I care about in my communities. So I thought about, what can I do? What can I do about this? So I work at Urbanism Next, and we are looking at the ways our digital devices, our smartphones and computers, are changing how people and goods move. So thinking about new mobility and e-commerce, what are some of those first order impacts? And then really, how is this going to change the built environment? So what are the changes to land use and urban design, building design, transportation and real estate? And then ultimately, what are the implications for the things we really care about? So equity, health and safety, the environment, especially greenhouse gas emissions, and the economy and jobs. And so I'm sure many of you are aware, one of the sectors that has the biggest impact on emissions is transportation, and the majority of those emissions come from the vehicles that probably you and I are driving, those light-duty vehicles. And when you look at the potential impacts, it really is terrifying. And I say that both from how I personally have been living with the implications of greenhouse gas emissions, but as well as what the research says. And so we really wanted to know what we could do about it. And so last fall, we received a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And what we did is really wanted to look into the research. What can the research tell us about the shared mobility and greenhouse gas emissions? And so I worked with a student that just graduated from the University of Oregon, Rachel Hess, and then with Nika Larko, who's the director of the Urbanism Next Center, on that literature review. And from that, we developed a policy brief, and that policy brief is now online, so you can review that. And for those of you who are interested as well, I'm just putting in the links to the policy brief as well as to this presentation. So you don't have to do a bunch of screenshots. You can go ahead and download that right now if you like. We've also updated a number of our web pages in the Nexus, which is our location online that really helps to summarize and to curate a lot of the information around emerging technologies. And then ultimately, we're finishing up with this webinar. I just want to give a shout out to an advisory committee that we put together. We've got, and joining us later today, Vineet Gupta from the Boston Transportation Department, Daniel Harris from Elemental Accelerator, Peter Hurley from the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and Adie Tomer from the Brookings Institute. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful working with them. So what did we do? We actually looked at shared mobility services. So bike share and e-scooters, microtransit, car sharing, ride hailing, and autonomous vehicles. And I was surprised and just by how many papers actually have been published, even within the last 2 years, and really over the last roughly 10 years. There was definitely a wealth of information, a lot, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and Asian countries. So there was quite a lot of information to be going through. And I know a lot more now than I did before. And so much of the research really focused on one or several of what I'm calling these kind of transportation emission factors for thinking about emissions with shared mobility services. And so, so the way that we really thought about it is like they were in one of these 3 different buckets. So the predictors of travel behavior and mode choice, so thinking about socioeconomic factors or the built environment, the 6 Ds, and they're spelled out actually in the policy brief. So, but things like density and design of communities, the distance between destinations, kind of things like that. And then of course the condition of infrastructure, are there bike lanes, are there sidewalks, things like that. How much does the transportation cost? How long does it take? Is there a person with a disability trying to use a service? Kind of things of that nature. And of course, one of the other things we thought about was not just what's the research around the impact on emissions, but also what are the equity implications? So we were paying attention to that as well, and thinking about the user familiarity with the technology, whether a person's banked or unbanked, things of that nature. And then once you've kind of considered some of those factors, then thinking about the emissions variables of EMT, congestion, and induced or latent demand. So how many more vehicle miles traveled or fewer as a result of using these services? What about congestion and really, when are people taking these trips? And then are they taking trips that they otherwise would not have taken, that induced or latent demand? And then finally, kind of once you've got that bucket or you thought about that, what are the vehicle life cycle emissions? What's the energy source? Is it electric or fossil fuels? What's the mode you're replacing? And then what's the new mode you're replacing it with? And so all of these factors have some implications for whether or not emissions are going to increase or decrease. One of the questions I had as we were going through the research was, how do these different services compare? How much better or higher or lower are emissions for bike share as opposed to, using your own personal vehicle? And so I've got some sources for the figure that is listed here, and I highly encourage you to read these particular reports, they just go into so much more information and give it some nuance. And definitely take this with a grain of salt, that if it has the I behind it, it's international estimations. And then I did want to include some information about vehicle use from the United States, because again, our mix of vehicles that are actually registered in the US, almost half are SUVs, so higher emitting type of vehicles. So the international averages might not be very accurate, or might underrepresent the emissions implications. And also, one of the things that was striking to me as well is just the difference between privately owned, like bike sharing e-scooters, versus the shared version, and just the difference in emissions from those. In the policy report itself, I do have some summaries of the, what are some of the factors that are likely to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by using that particular mode, or increase emissions using that particular mode. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but because primarily I'm going to be talking about how we got to this point with some of the research that I'm just going to, just a small amount that I'm going to particularly highlight. So for example, and I know that there's new information that just came out from NABSA, the North American Bike Share and Scooter Association, but I think this gives you a good idea. We saw some patterns with who uses shared services, and I would say maybe some of those first adopters tend to be more affluent. They tend to be younger, white, often male, compared to the rest of the community. I will say also that population density and kind of proximity to transit, or really population density, also you tend to see more people using shared services. There was a fair amount of research that indicated that there were beneficial greenhouse gas emissions were reduced in the presence of both bike share and e-scooters, and so it was great to see the variety of information that was available. The e-scooters were interesting. Most of the research, I would say, really focused on maybe even the first and second generation of scooters. And so when you look at the life cycle costs of those scooters, 50% of the emissions were from creating the scooter, and then another almost, not quite half, was from actually the pickup and charging and then redistribution throughout the system. But what we've seen, the recommendations from many of those reports, was to make sure you have maybe electric vehicles doing that redistribution. But what you saw, industry is really starting to respond by making sure that those vehicles last a longer time, as well as creating the swappable batteries. So you don't have to move the vehicles themselves, you can just swap out the batteries. So I thought it was an interesting example of industry really trying to help to find solutions as well. I did want to show a couple of the studies that looked at, what does micromobility replace when you ask people what would they have otherwise chosen. So we've got some examples from Edinburgh and Shanghai, some international examples, but even with e-scooters down below, you can see, and this was a variety of, actually this is from the national survey. There has been some research that shows a reduction in VMT and emissions and vehicle ownerships from bike share. And one of the studies I found very interesting from Switzerland that said that personal e-bikes and personal e-scooters emit less CO2 than the mode they replace, but shared services emitted more. And this is, I think, where it's important to understand the mode mix, in that in Europe, there may be more of a replacement of walk, bike in transit than perhaps in a typical city or community in the United States. So it's important when looking at some of this research to think about, what does this mean for in the United States context. Microtransit and car sharing, there was a lot less research, definitely related to microtransit, a little bit more related to car sharing. But I think this is where the research starts to talk a little bit more about how do you support households that are either car free or car light. And also start to think about the electrification and the implications of electrification for these services. And so for microtransit, it seems like some of the research really focused on, can we reduce private car ownership and dependence on your privately owned vehicle, and maybe being able to tie into transit service just a little bit better. Like I said, I think there's a lot more research that probably needs to be done to really determine if the impacts that microtransit could potentially have. For car sharing, again, support for kind of that car light or car free households. And one bit of research that I thought was interesting was the one that looked at the free floating car share that generally replaces walking, micromobility, and transit, while station-based car share tends to replace privately owned vehicle trips. So that might be, as communities are thinking about, are we going to have station-based or free floating car share, what might be more, which type might reduce more greenhouse gas emissions. Again, though, and maybe reflecting just the market penetration, which is pretty light for car sharing, the emissions impact was modest, was very modest in the research. Ride hailing, there's, I would say, kind of more implications for greenhouse gas emissions, and especially from the potential for additional miles from deadheading. Basically, those miles that the driver needs to drive from wherever they're starting to where they're picking up passengers, and then between each passenger, and then commuting likely back to home again. Let's see here. Some of the research actually made me wonder, are we going beyond just the first adopters and seeing a wider, group of people who are really taking advantage of some of these different services. So, for example, in Boston, a study of riders found that it was very similar even to like the micromobility, but they found a much more balanced representation in income. One of the biggest surprises for me was there were several studies that looked at who pools or shares their ride hailing, their ride hailing ride. And many of these studies kind of came to the conclusion that it's more likely that you will see vulnerable populations that pool or share their ride, and they're often getting pulled from transit onto ride hailing services. And in a different study, not part of this, but in the Miami-Dade County, some folks that we're partnering with on a different project, they were doing interviews with some of these vulnerable populations. And I remember when they interviewed this particular person that was like, if I'm having a good day, I'm not going to spend money on a coffee or going out to lunch. I'm going to pay to be able to get home earlier so I can get dinner on the table and I can spend time with my kids. Like, time is a luxury, especially for the most vulnerable populations. And so how do you balance the desire to provide, a fast and efficient and comfortable and safe transportation choice, and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and making sure everybody kind of has the ability to get where they need to go and not have to spend too much of their time. And definitely lower income people are paying with their time. There's a lot of studies that are looking at how ride hailing is replacing, what are the different modes that they're replacing. So when you ask people, if you take a ride hailing trip, what would you otherwise have done? And again, I think what's important to think about from here is that it really, and a lot of times it depends on how, what is the mode split anyway. So if you look at the Dallas-Fort Worth, that second to the bottom row, where a lot of people are much more car dependent. And so it makes sense that they would replace, if they're taking a ride hail, that they would replace either a taxi trip, their own personally owned car, or getting a ride from somebody else, most likely somebody they know. So, basically kind of carpooling. And they wouldn't replace as many walk, bike, and transit trips because there's probably fewer people that are doing that anyway. When you really dig down into the questions about congestion and BMT and kind of that latent or induced demand, there's some studies here that I think are very interesting, and one that really jumped out to me was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they found both ride hailing and other shared modes are 4 times higher in the county and city of San Francisco compared to the surrounding counties. And so I think, and this is reflected in the other research that we did, that you see the shared services used so much more in those kind of high density communities and neighborhoods where people could otherwise walk, bike, or take transit. And so that one, I just, it stays with me for sure. Also just thinking, another surprise, it really does make a difference, both with ride hailing and car sharing, and eventually probably autonomous vehicles, that emissions are reduced significantly if it's with an electric vehicle versus regular fossil fuel. And the study of ride hailing vehicles, that only less than 1% of all electric vehicles in California are used by ride hailing drivers, but they consumed 30% of the total energy demand at fast charging stations. So it's important to understand, and this is kind of where I get down to the details are important of how infrastructure is used, and given the potential impacts, like maybe that is how California wants to, maybe that is the population that they want to make sure is using, really supporting electric vehicles with ride hailing. But it's important to be able to measure afterwards, here's the policy we designed, and is it being used the way that they intended it to be used? And then autonomous vehicles. And I just want to say, this study by Masser et al. Really kind of inspired me to think about what what are the factors that decrease emissions or increase emissions. So I definitely use that as a model. And with autonomous vehicles, there's only a very limited, very small commercial services on the ground. And so much of the research is really around modeling or surveys, asking people how they think that they might use these things. And so, and what's fascinating too is that even automated service, I'm not getting it exactly right, but the, let's see here, the adaptive and automated capabilities in cars that are available today are having an impact on how much people drive. So for example, one study looked at just for some men who drove that have backup cameras or adaptive cruise control and automatic braking, their VMT went up by 14%. For pretty much the same thing, it increased by 40%. And if you drive a Tesla with autopilot, then those drivers are driving about 4,800 more miles per year. So the impacts are happening kind of in real time, even before the full autonomous vehicles are on the ground. Another study that I just find fascinating, UC Davis is doing some really great work. They did something called the Chauffeur Experiment, where they had small group, 47 households, and over a 3-week period, they observed how they traveled the first week, and then they basically gave them a chauffeur that could drive their car and simulate what it would be like to have an autonomous vehicle, could go out and run errands for them. And then the 3rd week, they took the chauffeur away and just saw if their mobility changed. And overall, they saw that VMT increased by 60%, and that it increased the least with households with children and the most with households with older adults. And the outlier was a household that had one older adult and a person with a disability, and their VMT increased by 700%. And they said once they were no longer tethered to the transit schedule, they could really go out. They could go out at night. They could socialize. It really improved their quality of life. So again, kind of that, the quality of life versus the emissions implications of that. And again, UC Davis did some modeling of a variety of different scenarios. And because of the deadheading and the additional induced demand, every scenario increased VMT kind of across the board compared to the business as usual. As I mentioned, we did look into kind of what are some of the, whenever the research emphasized anything that had some emphasis with equity, we were paying attention to that, and our research also communicated some of those. Bike sharing e-scooters, micromobility is definitely, many communities are incorporating equity elements into their plans, and I think there's been some very positive work in that particular area and some good research around that. Like I said, with Microtransit and Car Share, there's limited information, though with Car Share, there definitely is a financial savings in being able to use car share services. And so that's important to understand. Also, some of the research shows the potential for ride hailing to compete with transit, but there's also evidence that it provides kind of that quality of life service when transportation is really important and can get people where they need to go. And then finally, with autonomous vehicles, you know, there's both the potential for services to provide, you know, really open the opportunities for people that have especially mobility concerns, but they may need additional support, human attendants, to really help them get from door to door. So in conclusion, there's a lot more here, but without a doubt, the mode with the lowest greenhouse gas emissions from the research is really around walking, personal and shared, biking and e-scooters, and public transit. Microtransit and car sharing can support car-free or car-light households, but it remains to be seen. I think more research is really needed to understand the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And personally owned vehicles and ride-hailing vehicles are likely to emit the most greenhouse gas emissions from transportation today, and AVs are unlikely to make the situation much better. But electric vehicles will definitely help. With that, I am thrilled to bring into the conversation Vineet Gupta, who was on my advisory committee, and Eric Hesse. Sorry, too many screens. And I think with that, I'll just go ahead and bring you on. Sorry, so there you are. I'm gonna stop sharing. Excellent. Welcome, Vineet. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to see that you removed the mug shots there. So thanks for doing that.
Excellent. And I know we've got some questions, and I'll get to those, but I've got just a few questions for you two. And Vineet, I'll go ahead and start with you. I mean, one of the reasons that I asked both Boston and Portland to help advise on this particular project is because I know both of the cities really, you know, really are making a lot of adopting policies and making a lot of changes programmatically to address definitely emissions from transportation, and you do a lot with emerging technologies and shared services also. So Vineet, can you just tell us a little bit about what Boston's doing and why you wanted to be, you know, part of this project?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me start by saying that the research that you've done and the invite that you gave us to participate in your work has been helping us kind of inform some of our decisions as we move along on the policy front here in Boston. But fundamentally, kind of the bedrock of what Boston is doing is driven by our focus on getting more people in public transport and on bikes. And so we have very aggressive kind of aspirational goals over the long term to, for example, we want to reduce motor vehicle, single occupancy vehicles kind of by half by 2030. That's our aspirational goal. And we also have a carbon neutral by 2050 goal. And so public transportation for us plays a key role in any discussion that has to do with shared mobility. And we understand the importance of shared mobility and have, in fact, several programs that go into some, which have been in kind of operational in Boston for many years now. But we try to see that those programs can do two things. One, that they can complement the existing kind of public transportation backbone that we have here in Boston. And two, we see if those shared mobility kind of services can provide more transportation choices for neighborhoods that are not well served by public transportation. So those are kind of two sides of the same coin, but that's kind of been our policy focus. We're particularly proud of our bike share program called Blue Bikes, which has seen amazing ridership given the size of Boston. It's actually a regional network with our surrounding communities, Cambridge, Somerville, etc. And so that's one shared mobility piece that we are very proud of, and it has shown amazing kind of outreach in terms of access, and it's available in every neighborhood in the city now. Similarly, Zipcar actually started in the Boston and Cambridge area, and so we've been in partnership with Zipcar for more than a decade now, and in fact have worked with Zipcar in the last 3 or 4 years to have them locate their kind of shared parking spots on our municipal lots in neighborhoods that don't have good public transportation. And that has been hugely successful. And research has shown that there are more car-free and car-light households since Zipcar has started to operate in Boston. And finally, we understand the importance of ride hail, and we want to make sure that Boston is welcoming to ride hail, but we are also responsible and not creating unnecessary trips. And so working with the state, there are policies in place where if you are sharing a ride hail trip, there's less charge by the state. And we're also making sure that there is access to the curb for ride hail companies to pull up so that they're not blocking a travel lane or creating unsafe situations. So we've had several pilot programs to see how that works here.
That's great. Eric, I know City of Portland is one of the few places, definitely or maybe one of the first, with specific goals related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions as part of your e-scooter program and pilots. And so can you just talk about the City of Portland's general, how they're thinking about it generally, and then I would just love to hear a little bit more about the e-scooter program and what you found.
Yeah, absolutely, Becky, and thanks again too for including us in this work. And it's really built on some early work we did that I can touch on in a little bit more detail. That's really helping advance that, bringing together other research. So just really valuing this as we continue to evolve and partner with our private sector partners and understanding how we can help use these to advance our goals, which is something I would very much echo in terms of what Vineet was presenting, and many of other city partners that we work with, is understanding how these new tools, if you will, can fit into an existing ecosystem of transportation choices and performance, and how we help manage that system overall. And so, right, the devil is in the details, or how those pieces fit into the big picture, if you will, and really kind of continuing to focus there. And so, we too start with our goals that similarly are net zero by 2050, 50% greenhouse gas reduction goal, along with very aggressive mode share targets to really almost flip the script. We made some progress there, so it's not quite totally flipping it, but to really get to 70% non-SOV mode share versus where we were about 10, 15 years ago at about 70% SOV mode share, right? So really, how do you move that while also advancing safety, equity, overall improving access, and all those important goals for the transportation system as well. So from that perspective, we have been excited to work with a range of partners in scooter share and in bike share and in car share, and both fixed and floating. Zipcar over many years, and now Free to Move as a free floating service in our community. And all that comes together, of course, also on the backbone of our transit system, which is still very much the backbone for our city and urban and regional growth strategy, and our centers and our corridors, and how we make sure these are complementary services, much like Vineet said, that expand hopefully the impact and efficacy of those existing services in many ways. So from that perspective, we have also wanted to figure out, great, how do these things fit in back to those devil in the details, and how do we understand what their GHG emissions are, as well as broader system impact, and that requires getting information. And that's part of what we do through our pilot programs and our other regulations, is to try to get the appropriate amount of information while protecting, private interests around investment and other things. But one of the things we did in the e-scooter program, to your question specifically, Becky, is and I think may have been one of the first to require life cycle analysis information, and pointing to the ISO standards to try to say, hey, here's how an internationally recognized means of doing this is done, and we really want you to provide some basic information around both the material elements of that, as well as then the use of that, according the way LCA, life cycle analysis, works. And I think what was pretty exciting about that is that it really helped both us as a city start to get some more information around those opportunities, but some of our private partners actually said, wow, we learned a lot from that, and we've made improvements to our product that are actually saving us money and emissions. So those are kind of some of the win-wins that I think can come from that space. That also then started to point the direction towards some of the other things you noted in your research, Becky, around, oh, great, there are some trade-offs here between some of the charging models and things like that. How do we understand how substantial those are? Things like that. So I think it really has helped to daylight some of that information, did help to inform, our selection on some of the pilots that we've done. And this helped to inform, some of what we're looking for as we do our now more permanent RFP that's actually out on the street right now, or in process, as we evaluate some of the models we'd like to see to help minimize emissions and improve efficiency overall. So
that's great. That's great. Let's see here. And so I know that I want to talk just a little bit more on kind of the equity related issues. And so, and definitely a lot of the research, like we really want to maximize the reduction in emissions, and you're trying to get people out of their personally owned vehicles and other, especially, fossil fuel vehicles as well. But even, some of the research in California was like, even if every single vehicle was electric, you still need to reduce total VMT by, I'm going from memory here, but in the neighborhood of 20% to really reach the goals that we're trying to achieve. And so, can you just talk a little bit about like your, personal as well as maybe organizational, or, really kind of thinking about the opportunity to reduce emissions, but then also kind of that trade-off of the practicality and the need for, a vehicle sometimes to drive somebody if you've got that is very time sensitive, for example. So you've got a job interview, or you've got to go pick up your kids, or you need to bring an elderly person to a doctor's appointment, or, you're going to give birth. There's all sorts of times and places where you need that vehicle to get you where you need to go, regardless of your income. So, and I'll start with maybe Eric this time, and then we'll go to Vineet.
Sure. Maybe as I get into that, I'll just note that I appreciate sort of that the note you made too around VMT and greenhouse gas emissions, right? As we've had, internal combustion engines be the primary motive force for a long time, we tend to think of those as the same, but they're not. And especially as we think about the broad range of goals, VMT is really a crucial focus. And actually, Oregon has been shifting its rules to really focus on VMT reduction, even as we make progress on GHG reduction as well. So I think there's just a number of things we might come back to from that basis. So just wanted to note that. In addition, I think, part of what we, maybe back to this notion of an ecosystem, what I think we've also come to learn over time is that nobody is a cyclist or a driver or a transit person, right? People meet their needs as they need to. And part of our job as cities, and what we can do working with our partners in the private sector and others, is to provide more options, right? So that fundamentally, hopefully what you have is the right tool for the right need at the right time in the right place. And so I think part of how we think about that is recognizing that, yes, in many of those circumstances you just described, Becky, an on-demand personal trip might be the best suited thing. if it's affordable, accessible, and all those other things, and recognizing how we need to reduce barriers to that, particularly for folks with either language or banking or other financial barriers that may not make the benefits of these as equitably available. Then also, frankly, how do we make sure the services are available more universally as well? And that's where, again, I think market forces and, if you will, regulatory forces need to interact, because at some time, I think it's pretty clear historically and frankly, just theoretically, right? The economists might recognize that those types of public goods would be under-delivered if it were a market-only approach. So how do we create encouragement in our systems that say, hey, that's great. We realize that, for example, our downtown core is probably your most lucrative market, and we absolutely want you to serve that richly so that we can get as many people that can use these services that works for them as you can, hopefully not cannibalizing transit too much for the trips that make sense to be using transit for. But there are other areas of the city that historically are more lower income, more diverse, racially, demographically, in other ways, where people may not have the same abilities, that we need to see you provide services there too, even if they'll be less lucrative. And I think that's an important piece that we've done. And as we've evolved from our pilots to our more permanent programs, I think what we've recognized is that being even more focused geographically around what some of those areas are is important. And that if we started to, for example, define the entire swath of East Portland, which is disproportionately demographically underserved historically and currently, that helps. But there's still a lot of dynamics within that don't distribute within that really big space. And so we're moving to a smaller cell geography to really start to say what you really need to do is distribute throughout this area so that it's meaningful to the user as well. So I think those are some of the learnings that we've done. And I'll acknowledge that we also need to make sure that we're attentive to what that means for the economics for the private sector providers as well, right? And that's a balancing act that hopefully good, transparent information exchange can help us optimize around.
That makes sense. Vineet, how's Boston thinking about that kind of question, like trying to improve equitable mobility, but also achieve your, goals related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, it's definitely something that is of concern to us, trying to find the right balance. Just wanted to kind of reiterate something that Eric said about providing people a choice of modes. So depending on the situation, and affordability, etc., people should have a choice of what mode they're taking to get to where they want to go. And we have a pilot here in Boston called Go Hubs. These are mobility hubs in a small neighborhood called East Boston, where we are trying to provide those choices where people can take a decision once they say come out of a subway stop as to how they're going to do their last mile. Mm-hmm. In terms of our strategies to kind of provide these choices in neighborhoods that are underserved, we have one advantage is that we actually own the city of Boston, along with its municipal partners in surrounding communities. We own the bike share system. And so we have a good leverage on the service provider. So we own the system, but we lease it out to the service provider who do the day-to-day management. And because we have that arrangement, it's easier for us to locate our bike share stations in neighborhoods that would otherwise the market wouldn't have allowed them. It may not have been profitable to locate them there. Similarly, when we put out an RFP for car share services to operate in Boston, we had conditions in that RFP that would require the service provider to locate throughout the city. Mm-hmm. And that's been the case. And as it turns out, those locations have actually been very well used and have been profitable, precisely because they don't have good public transportation access. And so we also understand that, ride-hail trips are going to take place because they're convenient. And our plea to ride-hail companies is that they should use more clean fuel vehicles than they currently are, because the VMTs are going to happen. Let's try and make them cleaner, so to speak.
Yeah, I imagine with the new infrastructure bill and the additional incentives, or the ongoing incentives, and probably the additional investment in infrastructure and charging as well, like it just starts to remove. people might have had.
It's tricky because in ride-hail services, the cars are privately owned. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's once you go into the details, as you said, the devil's in the details. It's very difficult to get a clean fuel ride-hail service, kind of universal service.
Yeah, when you have to get a lot of people to do specific things to achieve your goals, which I think most folks in public service are trying to do.
Maybe Becky, just a couple quick pieces. Just maybe I'll note I dropped a link into the chat. I talked a bit about the scooter program, but also want to honor our bike share program with our partners Lyft and our presenting sponsors Nike for Biketown, and really proud of both our ability to make that. I think I've understood it to be maybe the largest by area bike share system in the country currently, and really worked very hard with them to expand into those areas of East Portland and North Portland and others that weren't previously served, so that there's both service availability and then the Biketown for All program really working to build into the economic model a significant discount that really helps support the affordability access to that program as well as some other important adaptive services for those with differing abilities. So I just wanted to highlight that important work in that area as well. And maybe one other point to this, building on another Vineet's good point around sort of those modal choices, the other opportunity here is that you can combine modes. And I think that's another way that we can think about how, for example, some of the efficiency of rideshare can work with the efficiency of transit and ubiquity of transit, and to call out TriMet, our regional agency, and some of the work they've done as they've evolved their trip planner over time to really help work with some of the ride-hailing partners to show how you can connect those trips. And perhaps even if you're in a desert of the transit service, so to speak, immediately you could use ride-hailing to get to the transit system, perhaps that could split some of those costs and speed differentials, particularly from an equity perspective, but for others too, and start to get the benefits of each of those systems. So I just wanted to offer that model up as well.
Yeah, I feel like there might be, I haven't looked into it, so there might be research related to just how do you design your shared mobility services to support transit, to better understand like what are the different things you need to do to be able to do that. I did want to get to some of the questions that we have in the Q&A, and so if folks have any additional questions, feel free to add those in there. I see a couple from Robin Chase back in the beginning. About kind of the under availability of a service or mode and asking if the person had access to a personal car. And I have to admit, I am not very good when trying to go from memory, and I'm not exactly sure, Robin, which specific study you might be referring, but I know a number of studies have, and especially like with car sharing, did look at whether or not a person had their personal vehicle or maybe sold their vehicle. And so there's been a couple of studies that are like that. And so I'm not sure if that's totally where you were going to get to. And then just kind of related to if people had a personal car, how did they use these services? And there definitely are studies that identified, not just the socioeconomic, but the presence of a personal vehicle or how many vehicles they had in their household. And so I think you probably have to reference this specific research there. Eric and Vineet, is there anything else about that question you think I might be missing?
Maybe I would just note one other maybe dynamic to keep in mind here, right? It's important to maybe still look at the specific elements, and right, there was some interesting research around, maybe how the personal use of some of these e-mobility options compared to a shared model, recognizing that, right, as you're moving things around and providing that service, there are, I guess you can decarbonize that, but there's energy and there's activity that goes along with that. Now, part of what the benefit of that is introducing and make ubiquitous to folks these new services, right? And so part of that, like that can be that I see in Robin's question is also how does this relate to car ownership, which we also know is highly correlated with car use. And so if this is part of that car light lifestyle that your framework also recognizes, Becky, I think that's another way to sort of think about this is over perhaps a trajectory of time as individuals sort of evolve through their own mobility choices and behavior. So I think I just wanted to call that out a little bit more too, and would be interesting to make sure that how the data and the research indicates sort of any maybe transitions over time or how that correlates to whether you retain car ownership or not. And that's probably an important use or thought about how that correlates to, if you will, a household levels GHG footprint.
That sounds great. Excellent. Thanks. Let's see here. And then Courtney, you had asked about the figure citing the 16 million. That must be a typo because I know that there's many more than 16 million vehicles. I'm thinking there's a number that was supposed to be at the beginning of that. So my apologies, and I'll correct that in the policy brief. I'll fix that and put a new policy brief out there.
Yeah, that might be LA County alone.
Excellent. All right. So just looking at the questions we've got. Did the increase in VMT from vehicles with AV tech take into account the income of the owners? So the cars cost more, so there might be income bias here. I think for a lot of these vehicles, there was definitely, I guess the emphasis here, even with Tesla owners that don't have autopilot or haven't activated it, there was a difference between the total VMT that they were driving, and there might not be as much difference. And this, I'm not sure. Maybe there is more of a difference, and it might be in the research, and I just don't recall. But many of these vehicles that do have these particular technology options do tend to be fairly expensive vehicles. And so, but it is making it just easier, reducing the barriers to driving, and that feeling like it's easier to drive. And so I think that those trends we may continue to see, especially with autonomous vehicles, that make it, again, kind of easier for different people to drive and more comfortable. Let's see here. For AVs, the use of shuttles might have greenhouse gas implications that are quite different than the use of single occupancy vehicle cars. That is true, and it kind of comes back to thinking about, what we know from like microtransit. So, is it possible we might see shuttles that are basically feeders for, there's lots of different ways that the service could be developed and designed. But definitely I've seen services that either just move people around like a downtown region or within a campus, or potentially within a neighborhood that's a little bit more spread out to some kind of high capacity transit. Like actually, Vineet, has Boston, I know that there's been some shuttle pilots, I believe, in Boston, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but have you thought about, what that might look like?
Yeah, we do have several shuttle programs in Boston. They are, for the most part, run by employers. There's one in Mission Hill that's run by a neighborhood community group. We have talked about how these could potentially. There have been entrepreneurs who have come and talked with us about EV shuttles, and whether we can help them make those available to shuttle services here in Boston. So it's an ongoing conversation, but as far as I know, currently there are no EV shuttles in Boston. Okay.
Yeah, Eric, I don't think there's no shuttle services that I know about that you would know more than me.
Not in the AV space. We do have more microtransit shuttles, things like that. But yeah, I think that's answers.
Yeah. So the next question really, starts to speak to, there's been a lot of, pandemic has changed a lot of things besides the fact that I just bought toilet paper for the first time at Costco on sale just this last weekend. So, ride hailing, of course, really went down during the pandemic, and it seems like it's starting to come back a bit. And pooling, I believe, just within the last couple of weeks, pooling was reintroduced, or shared rides in a handful of different communities across at least the U.S. And so, there's, the research around the impacts of the pandemic are just starting to come out. So there's not a lot of the research that I was looking at that looks specifically to trends related to the pandemic. Are there any trends, so you guys have at least, scanned some of this work. Are there trends from the pandemic that you see as, related to greenhouse gas emissions and shared mobility that we really need to think about maybe just a little bit differently? Vineet, I'll let you go first.
No, I think I mean, everybody knows that VMT went down to some extent in the early days of the early months of the pandemic, and car travel has gone back up to 70, 80, 90%, while transit is still lagging. But I will take the liberty of actually saying that one of our principal subway lines, the Orange Line, has shut down for 30 days for necessary repairs, which is quite a big thing right here in Boston nowadays. And what we did was we made our bike share system free. So you can get a 30-day pass today, but you can't have more than 2 hours in your trip, otherwise charges kick in. And the last 3 days have experienced the highest ever ridership on our bike share. Like each day is a record. And so there are many people who have actually taken on biking as their mode of travel to get to work or where they have to go. And we're hoping that that habit remains once the Orange Line comes back. But the point I'm making is that these kinds of situations, a pandemic, shutdown, provide opportunities for public sector to take specific action to try and do that mode change behavior, give incentives to encourage that mode change behavior.
Yeah, Eric is in the city of Portland, taking advantage of major changes in the way people's
Yeah, I think we might have even had some other Urbanism Next webinars or some NECTO webinars with you all on them. But yeah, and obviously that, what does the pandemic rod as its own webinar at least. I think we have had some similar experience with our own Bike Town promotions and getting use there, but also then just introducing people to different ways of getting around, the fact that at times there are lower volumes made for safer biking and walking, introducing people to our networks. All of that's been, I think, a great opportunity, and we've also recognized and are frankly grappling with it in our own regional transportation plan update in the region here that we have seen transit ridership go down. Yeah. We're seeing it recover strongly, but there are still perceptions of safety. There are challenges with labor supply and other things. And so I think we are wanting to make sure that we can continue to really support the viability and vitality of transit in that region. And I think the other thing to note, apropos of this conversation, is as the rides that were fueling a lot of the growth in the industry have gone down, there are challenges economically there that coincide with other transitions from, if you will, venture capital funding to more public offerings and Wall Street support. And I think those are other dynamics that we're seeing play out in terms of viability of various models and sort of, frankly, cost of those models too. There's been obviously a lot of talk recently around how perhaps some of the subsidy that we saw in the system previously is dissipating. What does that mean for how these fit into our ecosystem? I think is an ongoing thing for us to all be tracking. I wanted to note a few of those trends as well. Two of the good points that Robin's followed on there and that Nico's noted too, right? How does this fit into a lifestyle overall, right? And how does that fit in there? Also, particularly from an equity perspective, right? If that $12 to $14 that the interview you plotted is actually 24 to 26, is that still the same option? And I think those are some of the things we're grappling with now too.
Yeah, any other last thoughts?
I think from one of the most important things that we focused on during COVID was that bus routes that served the poorest neighborhoods were back to 80 to 90% ridership compared to other bus routes. Yeah. And so we actually here in Boston have made those bus routes free. And ridership has really picked up. And so it's same thing, outdoor dining is not about the dining, it's about the restaurant workers. And so, there's been a fundamental change. And I think Eric would agree that that we have been able to introduce more kind of ways of travel with less emissions. We put up bike lanes in literally in 3 weeks during the the peak of the COVID, because there was no traffic, and those are not permanent if you go out there. And same thing with bus lanes. We put miles of bus lanes in Boston in the last year.
That's great. That's great. We are at the top of the hour. I know that there were still some questions that we weren't able to get to, but I did just want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon. I know it's late afternoon on the East Coast, a little earlier on the West Coast, and of course everyone in between. Vineet, Eric, thank you both for all the time you put into preparing for today and other updates to the reports as well. So thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining us.